Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in today's video I wanted to talk about the history of the Legio Custodes, the golden armored protectors of the Emperor. Almost everywhere that you read about them, they are referred to as mysterious and their past as being obscured. My goal while making this video was to take away some of that mystery and obscurity. First, I will do a brief history of the Legio, then afterwards I will explore the possible themes and ideas about the faction. Without further delay, let's get into it. When the Emperor of Mankind arose to unite humanity during the Age of Strife on Terra, he knew that he needed to do so by force. The planet was ruled by techno-barbarian warlords and had become an irradiated war zone of perpetual violence. The Emperor needed armies. He needed military strength if he was to bring about a new age for the human species. Using his expansive knowledge of science, the Emperor would raise the Genos. The Genos were the first armies that the Emperor commanded during the Age of Strife, at the beginning of the Unification Wars. They would be the first of what would later be described as the Imperial Army. But they would be different from their successors in that the Genos were partially genetically engineered. This genetic manipulation done by the Emperor and his scientists was to assure that they had at their command some of the strongest and most survivable of human forces on Terra. Using these Genos, the Emperor secured his military strength on a basic level, but as he began to face the variety of horrific foes on Terra, he soon realized that he would need stronger forces. The Genos would be kept as his primary fighting force. As he carried on the Unification Wars throughout Terra with them, he would gain more armies from conquered foes and new allies. Many of these new armies were useful for the conditions of the Unification Wars, but would be discarded once Terra was seized by the Emperor. The earliest armies, however, those Genos, would be allowed to continue service well into the Great Crusade. Called the Old Hundred, these regiments of the Imperial Army were honored for their contributions to the fighting strength of the growing Imperium. Part of the reason that they were honored to the degree that they were was because they served as the foundation for the Emperor's future transhuman warriors, both metaphorically and literally. One of the oldest of these regiments, the Genos 25 Chiliad, was one such regiment known for its genetic manipulation. Soldiers of the 25 Chiliad were bred for physical strength. The strongest and most well-built of the regiment would be selected to reproduce until the main fighting force of the regiment were strong, muscular men. Any women that were produced during this process would have their ovaries removed and their eggs used to continue the growth of the Chiliad by producing these hulking fighting men. These women would then lead the Chiliads, having a brief psychic connection to them, which would improve battle performance. This would on a basic level make the Chiliad genetically related to each other and led by their genetic mothers. This process of guiding the genetic expression of soldiers and selecting those of strength would in fact lead to the Emperor developing the means of creating the Thunder Warriors. Specifics are unavailable, but it is known that the first Thunder Warriors came from amongst the Emperor's early fighting force, the early Imperial Army. Choosing from the already genetically strongest and conducting further experiments onto them, the Emperor would create the Thunder Warriors, hulking monstrosities of men who would serve as the shock troops of the Imperial Army. The Thunder Warriors would collectively be referred to as the Legio Custodes, or the Thunder Legions, and would be organized into what could be referred to as proto-legions, but were in actuality regiments of around 100 warriors each in the beginning of their formation. Each legion was different from each other aesthetically, but they all would bear the raptor and lightning head, the sign of the Emperor's armies during the Unification Wars. The Thunder Warriors were efficient tools, bred fighters who knew nothing else. They were led by figures referred to by the military rank of Primarch. The Thunder Warrior Primarchs were genetically identical to the warriors of their regiments, echoing some of the practices of the early Genos, but they possessed a greater stability, self-control, and ability to command. It would appear that at least 4 Thunder Warrior legions had been created by the time one of the earliest battles in the Unification Wars was fought, because it was the Primarch Ushoten of the 4th Thunder Legion who fought at the Battle of the Red Frost ahead of the cold weather specialized regiments of the early Imperial Army. Also present at this battle were 30 warriors of the Legio Custodes. There is much speculation about the Custodes and when they would emerge amongst the fighting forces of the Emperor. Some claim that they were his first transhuman creation, predating even the Thunder Warriors. Others say that they were created after the Thunder Warriors. Available information, however, indicates that they were likely created around the same time, before a separate purpose. Available information states that one of the earliest appearances of the Custodes was at the Black Manse of Nassau. Chiseled on one of the foundations was written that the Emperor came to them, the Lord of Lightning, with 4 giants of gold and crimson, demanding surrender. Assuming that those figures were Custodes, solar decades later, 30 Custodes would be present at the Battle of Red Frost. Decades after that, 100 would be present at the Battle of Mount Ararat. The Custodes emerged at an unspecified time very early in the Unification Wars. It would seem that the Emperor already had in mind that he wanted to create a specialized force of warriors and made attempts at doing so, even as he was mustering his imperial armies. Available information states that the first member of the Legio Custodes was Constantin Valdor. The child that would later become the figure known as Constantin Valdor was raised on Terra during the Age of Strife, soon after the Emperor of Mankind initiated the Wars of Unification. The Emperor would go to extreme lengths to acquire him, commanding massive armies across Terra in order to obtain him. The Emperor would kill Constantin's parents and take him as his own. From there, Constantin Valdor would be subjected to the physical modifications and psycho-indoctrination to be transformed into the Emperor's first successfully transformed Custodes. As such, Valdor would be the archetype from which all other Custodes were made. He was armored in a golden warplate called the Corinthine armor, which was very similar to the Emperor's own armor in the material used to create it, and the Emperor would give Valdor his own war spear, called the Apollonian Spear. For a time, Valdor was the Emperor's only custodian, his right hand and herald. Though it would take decades, more custodians would be made, a minimum of 3 according to available records. By the time the Emperor reached the techno-barbarian stronghold of Nassau, he was accompanied by 4 custodians, one of whom was certainly Constantin Valdor, and the other 3 were named Sagittarius, Ixion, and Gessaric. Soon after this, Constantin Valdor would be tasked by the Emperor of Mankind to assassinate the Minister of the Anuitan Steppes, Koja Zu, for her crime of stealing water from Terra's last ocean. She would be killed, and her son would be taken as a potential recruit for the Legio Custodes. Her son would be renamed Ra Endymion. In the decades to follow, more Custodes would be made from the sons and nephews of Terran nobility in the nation-states that had submitted to the Emperor's rule, sent as tribute to the Emperor. Ra Endymion would eventually lead 20 of these tribute Custodes, a group called Squad Dynasties, and referred to by the Emperor as the Lords of Terra. Constantin Valdor, Gessaric, Sagittarius Malacu, Ixion Hale, Ra Endymion, 5 other unnamed Custodes, and the 20 Custodes of the Lords of Terra would be the original 30 created during the early Unification Wars. It would be these 30 Custodes that would be present during the Battle of the Red Frost. Being that Constantin Valdor was the first custodian and his role would eventually become a warrior class, the organization of the Legio Custodes was still forming as the organization grew. Being the first amongst them, Valdor became the Captain General of the Legio Custodes. Ra Endymion and Gessaric, 2 of the oldest Custodes by service to the Emperor, would become tribunes, or advisors to Valdor, and the rest of the original 30 Custodes would form the basic fighting force of the Custodes, which would be called the Hykanatoi, or the Custodian Guard. The Custodes were, from their very inception, superior to any fighting force that existed on Terra. Created through non-surgical, non-invasive means, physically they were perfect, with a build reminiscent of statues of ancient heroes. Far taller than the standard human, Adeptus Custodes stood 9 feet tall and were beings of immense strength. The Emperor's own perpetual genetic information was incorporated into theirs, extending their lifetime by thousands of years and slowing their aging process significantly. No deformity or genetic deviance would be theirs to bear. Their armor would be the finest armor that could be constructed, made of oromite, an incredibly rare substance that was nearly inert on a molecular level and had a lustrous golden color. Each suit of armor would be created without thought of expense or the amount of resources it would take to do so. Each pattern of Custodes armor created specifically for the task of its usage and modified to be unique to each of the custodians individually. Their Baroque armor was master-crafted, artificier wrought, covered in the symbols of the imperial aquila as a sign of their authority, and gems mined from the deepest parts of the earth. Despite the size of the Adeptus Custodes and even the weight of their powered armor, both barely made a sound in movement. The Adeptus Custodes were designed to withstand and endure grievous wounds even without armor, but their armor provided extra forms of protection, each being fitted with a refractor field which could stop most forms of small arms fire. And the layers of oromite alloy would also serve as superior standard of armor, making the Custodes nearly unstoppable. The standard weapon of the Custodes was the Guardian Spear, a combination of power spear and master-crafted bolt weapon. It doubled as a weapon of combat and a symbol of office. Psychologically, the Custodes were conditioned to be utterly without fear. The experience of emotions unattached to logical processes was impossible to them. Therefore, they were not capable of impulsive actions, hesitation, or outbursts of emotions. They were made to be confident in their ability, focused and vigilant at all times. Their purpose was in the name of their order, to be custodians, primarily to safeguard the Emperor's well-being and carry out his will directly. They would be freed from the limitations of morality in their duty. There was nothing that a custodian would not do to protect the Emperor, and there was nothing that they were not allowed to do in order to protect him either. They were made without the ability to experience the emotions of pride and arrogance in their own ability, so they did not see their power as separate from their responsibility, and they did not interpret their responsibility as privilege. This made it so that nothing else truly mattered to a custodian beyond direct service to the Emperor of mankind. They could not refuse an order given to them from the Emperor. Whatever he asked of them, they would answer if they knew, and once an order was given to a Custodes, they would complete that task without delay or die trying. A Custodes would rather die than to fail to complete an order from the Emperor, and they would rather kill themselves than endanger him. Their fates were so inscrutably tied to the will of the Emperor that they were merely direct extensions of his will. The armor that they wore, its splendor, represented the Emperor of mankind. Their deeds were the Emperor of mankind's deeds, not their own. When they spoke, it was with the Emperor's authority. Not everyone could be a custodian. The ranks of the Legio Brotherhood were only open to the children of the nobles across Terra who had joined the growing Imperium of Man. Royal blood ran through the veins of each custodian, unacknowledged and not remembered by them, forgotten in their psycho-indoctrination. Some would keep aspects of their name, which would be indicative of where they came from. Some others would be given new names, like Ra and Endymion, partially named after Egyptian sun god. However, the tradition of the Custodes was to extend their personal names in accordance with their accomplishments. This would seem like an exercise of pride, but it was more of an acknowledgement of rank amongst the Brotherhood. The most experienced Custodes had the longest names. None had a longer name than Constantin Valdor, but others such as Gesseric and Ra and Endymion had over 900 names even before the Wars of the Unification would end. During the early unification wars, the responsibility of the Custodes was both to safeguard the physical being of the emperor at all times, as well as command the imperial armies with the power of the emperor's authority. However, as the unification wars were approaching their end, their role began to change. As time went on, the instability of the Thunder Warriors would be made more obvious, as they would not only repeatedly lose themselves to the tide of battle, ignoring direct orders, but physiologically, they would degrade. Organs would fail and their bodies would break down, killing them. The Emperor needed a more stable shock troop force and would begin further experiments that would eventually lead to the creation of the Proto-Astartes, many of whom, like the early 1st, 5th, and 7th Legions, would fight alongside the Thunder Warriors and Imperial armies. Later on, the Emperor's experiments would lead to the creation of the Astartes Primarchs, deep in the hidden laboratories within the Himalayan mountains. It's important to note that the Emperor had always planned to create the Primarchs and acquired the psychic means to produce them in the Dark Age of technology on the world of Molech. It would, however, take him until the Unification Wars to figure out how to create their physical bodies. This points out that the Thunder Warriors were never intended to be a permanent fighting force, but only one that would help him seize Terra. Not only would the Adeptus Custodes be kept, but they would be able to fulfill their own intended role as the Emperor's bodyguard, because it would be the Primarchs who were intended to command the Imperial armies instead of them. Seeing the Thunder Warriors as a risk to the future he was building, at first the Emperor would refuse to replenish their numbers as they were naturally depleted by conflict or degradation. But as the last battles of the Unification Wars were happening, the majority of the remaining Thunder Warriors would simply need to be destroyed. The destruction of the Thunder Warriors would be the responsibility of the Legio Custodes. At the Battle of Mount Ararat in the Kingdom of Urartu, the majority of the remaining Thunder Warriors were slaughtered by the Custodes. Some had escaped the battle, but not enough to bring actual threat to the future. Besides, the degradation of their design would kill the majority of them who had escaped. However, for propaganda's sake, a different story would be told about how the Thunder Warriors met their demise, a story of bravery, victory, and sacrifice to cover up a much darker truth. At the end of the Unification Wars, the construction of the Imperial Palace would begin. Built upon the Himalayan mountains over where the Emperor's secret laboratories were, the Imperial Palace was to serve as the epicenter of the Imperium of Man, a symbol of its might and power. More like a small nation-state than a palace, it would primarily be where the Emperor retired after journeys across Terra and where nobles of Terra would meet. However, before both the Imperial Palace and the Primarch project were complete, the powers of chaos would strike, scattering the Primarch gestation pods across the galaxy. While this was an inconvenience, it was not a setback, and the construction of the Imperial Palace continued and was completed soon after. It is here that we saw a shift in the role of the Custodes. While their primary responsibility remained to safeguard the Emperor's physical being, it also became to protect his seat of power, the Imperial Palace. The importance of this was stressed when there was an attempted palace coup by the surviving Thunder Warriors Primarch Ushoten and an army of rebels. The coup was unsuccessful, and Ushoten was killed by Constantin Valdor himself, but the Custodes would learn from this event and adapt to prevent it from occurring again. As the Adeptus Astartes would be created and the Primarchs would eventually be discovered during the Great Crusade, the Legio Custodes barely left Terra in large groups. The majority of their number stayed in and around the Imperial Palace in protection of it. Those who left Terra directly accompanied the Emperor aboard his flagship, the Bucephalus. This group of Custodes would be known as the Heteran Guard, or the Companions. The members of the Heteran Guard were hand-selected by the Emperor and were a group of the best fighters amongst the Adeptus Custodes. The Heteran Guard were one of the two groups created from the Hycanatoi caste. The Hycanatoi were the basic fighting force, divided into the Heteran Guard, who protected the Emperor, and the Sentinel Guard, who were primarily a defensive formation whose responsibility was the protection of the imperial palace and the nobles within it in case of attack. Basically, palace guards. Within the Hycanatoi caste, there was another caste called the Tyrannotoi, who were the heavy shock troops of the Custodes that either took the form of Custodes wearing Aquilon pattern Terminator plates and the Sagittarium Guard. The Aquilon Terminators were to step in the event that the rest of the Hycanatoi were overwhelmed by an enemy. The Sagittarium Guard stood at the outer checkpoints of the Imperial Palace and were armed with rapid-fire bolt-gun-like weapons to repel siege attempts. There were airborne Custodes as well, though they weren't so much their own caste but part of the existing castes. There were the Venetarii, who were stationed within the Imperial Palace. Instead of being stationed on the ground, they were stationed in the high spires and rooftops of the buildings, scanning the ground for threats. If any was spotted, they would use their winged-shaped jetpacks to fly to the location and swiftly eliminate the threat. There were the Cataphractoi, who were the jetbike-oriented Custodes organized into Agamatus jetbike squads. There were the Moritoi, who were the Custodes who had been interred into Dreadnought sarcophagus and who served as part of the Hycanatoi. One of the first members of the Moritoi was Sagittarius, who fell at the Battle of the Red Frost. Lastly, there were the Ephoroi, the most mysterious order of the Custodes. They were tasked with assassinations, covert operations, and the like. The formation of the Tyrannotoi caste, as well as those specialized Custodes groups, came into being due to Terra's alliance with Mars because of the technology that was used. The Aquilon pattern Terminator armor was basically the Custodes version of Terminator armor, and Terminator armor wasn't used until after the alliance with Mars. The Legio Custodes would have their own arsenal, full of weapons and flyers and machines that only they could use, but which would fulfill any standard battlefield role, just with the focus of protecting the Emperor and the Imperial Palace. The role of the Custodes became more political as time went on, though they never gave up their role as guardians. For the most part, they were largely disattached from the progress of the Great Crusade beyond those areas in which they were directly involved. They mostly protected the Emperor and the Imperial Palace. For example, the Heteran Guard would accompany the Emperor as the Primarchs were rediscovered, with one of their number being killed by Angron in his discovery. A tradition that arose after the palace coup was the Blood Games, a military exercise where Custodes would take the role of an enemy combatant and attempt to infiltrate the Imperial Palace without being detected by the other custodians. This exercise, which would sometimes take years, was to test the effectiveness of the Custodes against themselves and to measure their preparedness. This enabled the Custodes to create multiple plans and commit to several changes to the way they protected the palace so that they would be ready for any threat. These war games would become useful later on. When Horus Lupercal betrayed the Emperor, the Legio Custodes already knew their stance and responsibility. It was what it had always been, to protect the Emperor and the Imperial Palace, and both were threatened by this heresy. But it wasn't even Horus who initiated the betrayal in the eyes of the Custodes. It was the Primarch Magnus. The Emperor started receiving information that some of the legions were practicing forbidden means of war under the direction of their Primarchs, or were otherwise deviating from the purpose of the Great Crusade. One such Primarch was Magnus, who had been utilizing the sorcerous arts. Seeing the threat of such practices, this brought into question whether psychers should be used in the legions. This led to the Council of Nicaea, which Valdor and a group of companions attended as a protective measure for the Emperor, in which it was declared that psychers would not be utilized in the Astartes legions and that Magnus must cease his practices in sorcery, with the threat of ruin should he continue. When the Emperor retired to Terra to work on the Webway project, Horus was left as War Master of the legions. When Magnus returned to Prospero after the Council of Nicaea, he continued practicing sorcery. While doing so, he saw a vision of the future of the Horus heresy. First, he would attempt to persuade Horus from falling to chaos, which was unsuccessful because it was too late. Then he tried to warn the Emperor, accidentally breaking into the Webway project and breaching the protective measures of Terra as the Webway project led to the inside of the Imperial Palace. The breach in the Webway allowed a tide of demons from the warp into it and provided them a direct path not only to Terra, but to the Golden Throne within the Imperial Palace. This led to the war in the Webway and the raising of Prospero simultaneously. Constantine Valdor would accompany Leman Russ to the planet of Prospero to bring retribution to Magnus for his folly, which would lead to the absolute slaughter of the Prosperan population. At the same time, the rest of the Custodes, along with the forces of the Mechanicus and the Imperial armies, would fight tides of demons that were attempting to gain access to Terra through the Imperial Palace while struggling to reconstruct the Webway. The Emperor himself had to sit on the Golden Throne, adding his psychic might to maintain its structural integrity during the early part of this battle. The battle in the Webway was perhaps the most defining battle of the Legio Custodes. It was essentially what they had been made for, to protect the Emperor and the Imperial Palace. They would fight for 5 years non-stop in the Webway, and by the end of it, 90% of the Custodes had been slain, and while they successfully won the battle in the Webway, there was a moment where they almost failed to protect the Emperor. When the Sisters of Silence were able to harvest enough Psykers so that the Emperor could rise from the Golden Throne without it losing power, the Emperor plunged into the Webway, appearing as a burning star in the midst of the fighting. It was here that Dracnian appeared. Dracnian was a demon known as the First Murder and the Fall of Empires. Transforming into a wailing sword, Dracnian would impale the Emperor, but the Emperor would remove the sword and throw it with psychically accelerated might into the body of Ra Endymion, who the Emperor commanded to run further into the Webway to create as much distance between it and Terra. As said before, the war in the Webway was only barely won by the Imperial forces within the Imperial Palace, but it was won. Now, the galaxy was torn apart in civil war as the betrayal and heresy of Horus Lupercal revealed itself. The Custodes did not play an active role directly in the Horus heresy. It was primarily to be a fight between the Loyalist and traitor Astartes legions. They had stayed true to their purpose, protecting the palace and the Emperor. It seemed that once again Valdor would be in charge of damage control of the Emperor's creations, but this situation was different than it was with the Thunder Warriors. The Primarchs had legions under their control and weaponry that could force entire systems to kneel. Therefore, the defense of Terra required that Constantine Valdor cooperate and interact with some of the Loyalist Primarchs, the few who were allowed anywhere near the palace, such as the Primarch Rogel Dorn, whose legion had built the very foundations of the Imperial Palace during the Unification Wars, and who had been tasked with the remaking of the palace into a fortress during the Horus Heresy, and Vulcan, the perpetual Primarch who would be needed in the Webway. As said earlier, by this time the Custodes had been extremely depleted. Most, if not all, of the Lords of Terra had been slain in the War of the Webway, and the enemy was approaching the Sol system closer and closer each day. Eventually, Terra was sieged by the traitor forces, but the remaining Custodes had been tested sorely by the war in the Webway and fought with an unrelenting fury to defend the palace. The most important moment was when the Emperor made the decision to face Horus Lupercal aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Constantine Valdor himself and what was left of the Heteran Guard accompanied him, joined by the members of the Sagittarium Guard for the intense fighting that would be met. During teleportation onto the ship, Valdor would be separated from the Emperor but would use his spear to locate him. Some of the companions that had successfully teleported with the Emperor onto the ship were corrupted by the overwhelming power of chaos on the ship, turning on the Emperor, who dispatched them quickly. Despite the speed and ferocity at which he fought through the winding corridors of the ship, Valdor would be unable to stop Horus Lupercal from mortally wounding the Emperor of Mankind. Horus Lupercal had been destroyed and the traitors were retreating from the throne world, but the Emperor of Mankind had fallen, barely clinging to life. What remained of the Emperor's body was returned to the Imperial Palace. Though the loyalist Space Marine legions would pursue and attack the remaining traitors, the majority of the Legio Custodes would instead take a vow of penitence, donning the black cloak of mourning over their golden armor, standing guard over the Emperor's slowly decaying corpse as a psychic energy was used to keep the Golden Throne operational. And there they stood, for thousands of years. Constantine Valdor would vanish and accounts would vary. Some would say that his armor and weapons never made it into the Hall of Armaments in the Imperial Palace, and others would say that his spear, the Apollonian spear, would be stored and revered by the Custodes. Some say that the Legio Custodes failed in their duty to protect the Emperor. Even the Custodes seem to agree with this, donning the black of mourning and taking oaths of penitence. But I think that it wasn't their fault that the Emperor met the fate that he did. No matter if the full force of the Legio had been present in his battle against Horus, none of them would have interjected if his will was that they did not. Likewise, they would have all died to protect him only for the same result to happen. It is my opinion that the Legio did not fail in their duty. The Emperor's body was still recovered, barely alive, but living. Placed on the Golden Throne, the Legio would return to their original purpose, to safeguard the physical being of the Emperor and to protect the place of his seat of power, the Imperial Palace. This video was about the glory of the Legio Custodes and not so much about the Adeptus Custodes as an organization in the 40k setting. While it would be fair to mention that they are a far more active faction in the 40th millennium, divided into multiple shield hosts that have roles from the depths of Terra to the edge of the Sol System and beyond, now that Roboute Guilliman has returned to the narrative. I think that these recent developments to the lore of the Custodes are contradictory to the large amount of history and lore put into defining their role as solely protectors of the Emperor and the Imperial Palace. However, there are two pieces of information that enable me to accept the role that they play now, if only to a degree. First is the existence of the Dankanatoi, a chamber of the Custodes that was founded during the last days of the Horus Heresy, who were specifically committed to hunting and exterminating traitors wherever they could be found. It should be noted, however, that they did not travel far from Terra and hunted the traitors attempting to leave it. The second point is the dreams of the Custodes. Earlier in the video I mentioned that the Custodes were basically the extended will of the Emperor. The connection that the Emperor had to his Custodes was on a genetic level. One of the ways that the Emperor gave information to the Custodes was through their dreams. While with most of them this would be limited to being during their moments of unconsciousness in the process to become a Custodes, some would continue to have dreams throughout their service. Ra Endymion was one such custodian. The Emperor allowed Ra to see not only his past and upbringing, but the future of mankind and his aspirations for the human species. He shared this with Ra so that the custodian would know what it was he would be fighting for when he was impaled with Dracnian and ordered to run deeper into the webway. After Ra's eventual death, another custodian would receive visions from the Emperor in the form of dreams. This custodian was called Diocletian Koros, and he would write down these visions in a tome that would be titled The Master of Mankind. This book is a sacred tome to the Brotherhood of the Legio Custodes and is still read 10,000 years later. There was even another Custodes who would receive visions from the Emperor in the 41st millennium, whose name was Thanasar. He would have his writings stored with the other writings of visions from the Emperor. Perhaps in one or more of the visions, the Emperor showed them their role in the current Imperium of Man. Perhaps they knew they would have to take a more active role in the galaxy with the return of Roboute Guilliman, but not because Guilliman needed it, or the Imperium needed it, but because the Emperor needed it, and a Custodes would rather die than not follow an order given to them by the Emperor. As with most things in the 30K narrative of the 40K universe, there are a lot of elements that are inspired by real historical events and figures, just with a little twist. The Legio Custodes at their base represent the guardian forces of prominent rulers throughout history and do not truly have a singular source of inspiration. However, there are some clues. The first appearance of the Custodes was said to be at the Black Manse in the techno-barbarian stronghold of Nassau. Nassau is in Germany. Nassau lost its independence due to pressure by Napoleon I, the French emperor. That part of the lore of the emperor going to Nassau and demanding they submit might have been based on the conquests of Napoleon I. Continuing with the Napoleon theme, Napoleon had his own army, the Imperial Guard. Sound familiar? The Imperial Guard were a small group of elite soldiers of the French army that were his bodyguards. They were their own detachment of the greater French army and had infantry, artillery, etc. As an elite force, they were used very carefully by Napoleon. Going even deeper, the Imperial Guard was divided based on level of experience. There were the young guard, the least experience, the middle guard with, more experience, and finally the old guard, the veterans. Napoleon had a strong connection to his old guard, who were extremely loyal to the French emperor and whom Napoleon referred to as his children. He selected many of the old guard due to their size and physical traits, as they were often taller than the standard person. The lore about the early Genos being genetically tailored and selected was likely inspired by Napoleon's selection of the Old Guard. In fact, the name Old Guard likely inspired the name of the Emperor's early regiments in the 40K lore, the Old 100. Even deeper, there's actually a list of the names of some of the regiments that belonged to the Old 100 in the 40K lore. There's also a list of the name of the divisions of the Old Guard cavalry of the French armies. Unsurprisingly, there are a few correspondences. The Angakorian Dragoons corresponds with the Empress's Dragoons, and the Tupolev Lancers corresponds with the 1st Polish Lancers. Also, check out the symbol of the French army. Kinda sorta reminds me of the Unification Raptor, not gonna lie. Now, in regards to Constantin Valdor, it is unknown where he was acquired by the Emperor. All that is known is that the Emperor killed his parents and took him. What started this whole deep dive was me asking myself, but where was he taken from though? My first assumption was that Constantin Valdor came from the techno-barbarian nation-state of Frank, or the 40K version of France, not because of anything to do with Napoleon, but because of his name. Constantin is both Latin and French, but Valdor is French and means Valley of Gold. There's another Custodes in the lore named Aracid Nassau, and it's suggested that he has some sort of connection to the techno-barbarian stronghold of Nassau. Following the idea that the last names could be indicative of where a Custodes could be from if their name wasn't changed entirely, I thought Valdor could indicate that Valdor was from Frank or France, but that wouldn't make any literal sense because the Valley of Gold wasn't even in France. At least with Nassau, it was actually in a techno-barbarian nation-state that made historical sense, Germany or Germany. So I went back to the drawing board. Being that there were so many Napoleon correspondences to the Emperor during this time, and Valdor was the Emperor's bodyguard in the lore, I researched if Napoleon ever had a bodyguard, and it turns out he did. Rustam Raza was Napoleon's Mamluk bodyguard. At 13, Rustam was kidnapped and sold as a slave in Cairo. The Sheikh of Cairo presented Rustam to Napoleon, and he served as a bodyguard to Napoleon for nearly 2 decades. Mamluks were slave soldiers, and Napoleon would make the Mamluks their own detachment of his imperial guard. Now, what I'm not saying is that this is 100% the story of Valdor and what inspired Valdor, but what I am suggesting is that some of the lore for Valdor might have been inspired by Raza, with the emperor moving armies to acquire Valdor and killing his parents, to have him possibly being inspired by Raza being enslaved and sold to Napoleon at a young age, only to become his bodyguard into adulthood. Likewise, the Mamluks being slave soldiers, they were under the direct command of Napoleon as his subjects, in the same way the Custodes were to the emperor. As far as the theme of the Custodes goes, they were clearly inspired by the Roman legions in spirit. That's partially why they were referred to as the Legio Custodes. Specifically, they might have been inspired by the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit from the Imperial Roman army that were the bodyguards and intelligence agents for the Roman emperors. The names used in the organization of the Custodes come from a variety of sources. For example, the Hakanatoi, the basic fighting force of the Legio Custodes, were named after an elite Byzantine guard unit. The Cataphractoi derived from the cataphract or heavily armored cavalry in numerous cultures. The emperor's flagship is called Bucephalus. Bucephalus was the name of Alexander the Great's horse, and there was already a connection between the emperor and Alexander the Great if you watched my Magnus video, but also it's in the lore of the Warhammer 40k universe that one of the identities of the emperor was Alexander the Great. So it makes sense that his flagship is called Bucephalus, which was the horse of Alexander the Great. Last but not least, aesthetically, I think the Custodes are inspired by the household cavalry of the British Army, because Warhammer 40k itself was made in the UK, so we have to take that into consideration. And also, the household cavalry protects palaces, of the British nobility. And so I think there's a very loose but direct connection between the aesthetic of the Custodes, who protect the Imperial Palace, and the household cavalry of the British Army. And that was my deep dive into the Legio Custodes. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe for more content. Share this video with people who you might think would like to watch it or hear it. And yeah, without anything else to say, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.